The presidential address right there, President Yoweri Museveni trying to let the people know why he instituted a total lockdown. You saw him trying to narrate what happened on the 18th of March, his very, very fast address. And then Saturday, when we did actually confirm our very first case of coronavirus in the country, he went on giving a slew of press conferences in that regard. But this time around, he said, we cannot wait for the worst to happen, and he had to call for that total lockdown. I have Emmanuel Mutaiziwa, a political investigator, and we're going to be expounding, a political editor, and we're going to be expounding on the presidential directive to make sense of it. Very good morning, Emmanuel Mutaiziwa. Thank you for joining. Yes. Viewers. So, what are the major takeaways from the presidential directive?
Well, first and foremost, I must commend the team, the presidency, the ministers, the task force. People have burnt the midnight candle to ensure that we bring the threat of coronavirus under control.
Indeed.
But whereas that's one thing, and whereas it's the common sense thing to, issue a lockdown, we must, try to look at some of the things that emerged yesterday. Mm-hmm. And we know very well that today there's a chance that the Interministerial Committee is going to sit, I think led by the Prime Minister, Ruakana Rugunda, to critically examine some of these, for instance, measures that were issued by the President in his address last evening. But specifically, I would use just one example. For instance, they said, one in his address, he said one of the new measures they are, putting in place is they are suspending private vehicles because they don't want, people to come into contact. They want to enforce social distancing and all these kind of things.
The borders and the tuk-tuks.
Yes. But from a pragmatic point of view, how is this going to work? That for the sick, you must first of all seek permission from the RDC or district medical officer.
Let's first talk about the rationale of the president behind calling for the same.
Well,
and then you can talk about,
I can't believe by that point any further. I've said it's a common sense thing for countries, even elsewhere, to try and bring this virus under some kind of control.
That is understandable, Mutaiziwa. But on the issue of banning private cars, the president said that most of these people were actually turning their private cars into passenger service vehicles, minus getting the license to do so. And they were charging exorbitant fees from our people. So he felt like, it's not working. And it can also aid the spread of the contagion.
That's the point I'm making. That, yes, it's fine to enforce a lockdown. But you must hypothesize and be, you examine the kind of measures you're putting in place. Because you don't also want to put in place measures that are going to be detrimental to the common man. For instance, one of the measures that, is being enforced is the measure that you must seek permission from the RDC before you transport the sick. Now, let's even not talk about the emergencies. Let's talk about people in their everyday lives. We have thousands of, close to millions of people who are ailing with diabetes, who need insulin. You have people who are hypertensive. You have people with cardiovascular disease. You have people who are on ARVs. How many calls practically would the RDC take to ensure that, they clear all these patients? How about emergencies? How about people who are, someone is typically having a meal and swallows a bone? When is the time that they are going to first call the RDC and district medical officer? So this is the pragmatism I'm talking about. That, well, the lockdown is fine because we need to control the spread of this disease, but how pragmatic are some of these things? So that's just one of the examples. Because what we must ensure is that we already have, people who have been sent home. Their means to employment are being curtailed. Some have lost their employment, but they'll still have the usual day-to-day challenges. They must, take their sick to hospitals because that's the most immediate need. And then too, we talk about the issue which is very important about social distancing and ensuring that people don't get into contact with one another to spread the virus. But yet again, this is the challenge that poor countries or third world countries are going to grapple with compared to the West. For instance, have we thought about many people who make over 50%, the people who live in slums in Uganda? How are you going to enforce social distancing when a family of 10 shares a shackle? How are you going to enforce that? So basically, the virus is going to, the pandemic is going to present more challenges in countries like ours, because it's also going to have a strain on our medical facilities as well. As you're aware, we have less ICU beds, we have less facilities, we have less trained personnel, we don't remunerate them very well. So these are some of the challenges that are going to come to the fore. But nevertheless, the lockdown is fine, but we must examine each of these measures and see if it's practical.
Okay, let me come to the rescue of the government. The president did mention that at every district they will have government vehicles on standby, just in case there's an emergency. Like you mentioned, a pregnant woman, someone is choking on the bone, those vehicles would be used as ambulances in the interim to actually ferry these people to medical centers where they can get help. Yes, that's what I was getting from the president. As long as the decentralization of this whole process has been, getting all these vehicles at the district level so that they can help people. But then the problem is one thing. Yes, these vehicles, these government vehicles and other private vehicles that they are going to get for this initiative, they do not have the requisite resources that an ambulance is supposed to have. Let's say someone is grappling with COVID-19, they have trouble breathing. Do these vehicles have the requisite ventilators to support this person's breathing en route to the hospital? I think those are some of the main challenges we can be talking about in that regard. What do you make of that?
Yes, it's first of all a good thing that government officials surrender the vehicles at such a critical time.
But do they have oxygen? Do they have all these resources?
Yeah, please. It's very fine. It's a good gesture because, as you're aware, we have very few of these vehicles. But nevertheless, an ambulance is a specialized car. It has some specific facilities. It requires specialized nurses and all these kind of things. And let's before we think about people with breathing complications who are suffering from the virus, because I spoke the other day to the Uganda Medical Association President, Dr. Idro, and at least he seemed to suggest that we've not yet registered a number of cases in that regard, people with complications like we see elsewhere in Italy, in the US, France, and elsewhere that require the ICU, the ventilator. But we have a number of cases of people who are going to need typically emergencies.
That are not related to COVID-19.
Exactly. And they will need an ambulance. Yesterday, the president said he would buy more vehicles from the donation he got from the Nigerian businessman, which is a good thing. But now is the time for us to reallocate funds on some of these, superfluous exercises, like buying V8 Land Cruisers for the government ministers, the money that has been, given now, allocated to the VIPs to travel abroad. For instance, in 2016, government spent close to 500 billion to treat a category of people in India. And clearly, like civil society says, this is discriminatory. We need now, the chickens have come home to roost. We need these facilities right here at home.
Taiziwa, you make a very good argument, but then let's talk about solutions-based journalism for a while. Okay, I was looking at a story yesterday. The United Kingdom recalled actually 20,000 medical officers who had retired. Some other countries are looking at having medical students who are in their third year graduated so that they can become medical professionals, so that they can start treating COVID-19 patients. In Uganda here, how can we maximize our capacity building to make sure that in case of a widespread outbreak, we have enough numbers of medical professionals to do the same?
Yeah, when the permanent secretary, Dr. Diana Twine, appeared on our Prime Talk show on the spot this Thursday, she was very specific, and she said government is seeking volunteers to come and, be able to join the team so that we can boost our numbers, we can boost those who are going to come and be at the front line in terms of combating this disease. However, she was also very specific and said these people require some specialized training before they can be sent to deal with this kind of stuff. As you are aware, when you're treating the virus, it's not like any other ordinary disease, like you're going to give someone a dose of Panadol. So it requires some, very specific way. For instance, I'm not a health practitioner whatsoever, but the little I know is when you go into the ICU, you need a specialized nurse. So it's a good thing. It's a good gesture to look out for, to try and increase the numbers of nurses and medical personnel and all the other specialized groups. And Uganda, I must also say, has built quite some robust, and good, reputation in regard to dealing with viruses like Ebola and Marburg. So, and we have the Uganda Virus Research Institute, I think one of the most thorough research institutes in Africa. So there are positives in this regard. And that's why you see, I think there's a tally, there's a trajectory in terms of numbers by the World Health Organization, infections, ability to combat the virus. And clearly Uganda is quite at the bottom.
Very, very, very down
because
there. Very down
of our, reputation, our, experience.
It's also interesting to say that we do not have any active coronavirus cases. There are only positive cases. I think our viewer was a little bit confused with the numbers. There is a country registering positive cases. In the case of Uganda, 33. But out of those 33, we don't have any active cases that are exhibiting mild symptoms. Just like the case with Rwanda, just like the case with DRC and Kenya. Sudan also, Northern Sudan, not South Sudan. But then let's talk about more issues to do with the markets and places where people sell food. So they'll be suspended for 14 days. That is the non-food markets, yes. But then the food markets will continue to work, but they shall be observing some kind of standard operating procedures, SOPs. Observe 4 meters on your left, right, rear, and the sideways. But then there's one contentious clause. You have to stay near the market if you're a seller. You don't have to go back home. How best will these people navigate life?
Well, that's one of the challenges.
It's a tricky one, yeah.
And definitely the other challenge are the factory workers, that they must stay at the factory. I don't know how many factories have the ability to
the factories can do that, but what about the marketplace, the common person?
The context is, this is an issue to do with food security, which is very important.
Indeed.
That as we have this lockdown, our citizens don't starve. One, the first question you'd ask is, now that, the ordinary people no longer have their means of livelihood, the people worked, typically the woman who woke up in the morning and went to the market store to sell a few, things like vegetables, the border guy, and, many Ugandans who live by hand to mouth. First and foremost, it is a good gesture that the presidency says they are going to distribute food to some of these vulnerable groups. How they are going to do it is something perhaps they would want to tell us in detail, and how they are going to identify.
I think Ruganda shall expound on that when they meet.
How they are going to identify these vulnerable groups. And then too, you talk about the issue of markets and ensuring that people stay there. I don't know how practical that's how practical that is.
It's a tricky one. Yeah.
I don't know how practical that is, and I don't know even the entire process to ensure that there's supply of food to the markets. For instance, now, as you're aware, the transport system is quite curtailed. So how do you bring the matoke to the market?
And how will the client even come to your marketplace to buy?
So for instance, if the market is about 2 kilometers, you'll have to walk. So that's also quite a strain. But sometimes we need to, face these very tough measures if we're to contain the virus. However, some of these measures, like I said in the beginning, we must try and, hypothesize and see how practical they are.
How practical they are. I've seen in other countries like China, Italy, United States, and a host of other countries. They called for lockdowns, but after calling for lockdowns, they went to these hot spots and started disinfecting all these areas. So I'm here wondering, the president yesterday first mentioned to us that the reason he called for a total lockdown was because some people had escaped from quarantine. Others had gone back, but he didn't know the magnitude or the scale the length these people had gone to actually infect other people, much as they had come back into quarantine. So if this contagion had spread among the public in the marketplaces, which are hotspots, and the president, the non-food stores, the arcades, the malls, so why are they not disinfecting? The first move I would understand is to go to these hotspots, if indeed there were any infected people in these areas, to kill the virus before people resume work.
Well, like you said, disinfecting is very important. I've seen even Nairobi has been, enforcing this. But perhaps it's a little too late because people have come into contact with others. I think it's also very important to place this under scrutiny. What exactly happened at Entebbe Airport when there was the institutional quarantine and then people were slipping through and evading this institutional
Corruption,
quarantine?
my brother.
What exactly happened?
Corruption.
So we must investigate, because this
And
is
the president mentioned it.
this is a matter of life and death. Who are the people who came in and as a result of their influence or positions and sneak their relatives? They must be held accountable. How did the Chinese woman
smuggle those 6 Chinese to Zombo?
These Chinese, what exactly happened at the airport? What if, I'm told the first time we got to know is there's this young man who was working at the hotel who recorded a video. He was, just curious. What if this hadn't happened? How many people could these Chinese have infected with the virus? So once again, the issue of corruption bore its fangs, and this is where the problem is. So we have, many people coming into contact with those who should have been placed under the institutional quarantine.
Indeed. That should have been the first thing to do. And I did talk to Jimmy Spokesperson Tongo. He's a lecturer at Makerere University. The moment he had just touched down at Entebbe Airport, he was put into quarantine at the Central Inn in Entebbe. So I took the liberty to call him to ascertain what was the situation. Were the workers at the Central Inn Hotel wearing some kind of protective gear while interacting with these people who just disembarked this airplane? They said no. They were actually interacting with the people who had just disembarked the airplane. There was no form of protective gear going on. Even the people who had just disembarked the airplane, they were just roaming around. No one was actually there to keep an eye, or a medical practitioner to keep an eye on these people. So it seems like the ball was dropped from day one.
Well, perhaps to look at the brighter side of things is what has already taken place. It's too late. We can't reverse the mess. We can't reverse the mistakes. What we need to do now is to look at how we can effectively combat the problem. So definitely you're right to say that, some of these measures were not followed to the letter. So what can we do now to ensure that we don't have many more cases?
Emmanuel Mtaiziba, we are still talking about the COVID-19 and the presidential directives. On Skype, we are now joined by our very own journalist and reporter, producer, Mr. Raymond Katari. A very good morning, sir. How are you doing this morning?
Hey, good morning to you, Romeo and Emma in the studio. I'm doing exactly fine this morning.
Mr. Kataha, I'm sure you've been following the conversation. What do you make of the presidential directives? Any major takeaways? Mr. Kataha, I think we lost Mr. Kataha, but as we seek that connection, Mr. Kataha will be telling us what he thinks in his own opinion might have... Oh, yes. First we'll get Raymond. We have Mr. Ivan Haman Walunyolo reporting live from Entebbe. Mr. Ivan, what's the latest from where you are? Are the people adhering to the presidential directive?
Well, Rami, I can tell you, first of all, these directives came at a time when most people were still at their workplaces, most people were still in trading centers. And I personally also fell a victim because I wanted to go and buy some things in the supermarket, but I can tell you that what I saw there was unusual. I saw very many people turning to the supermarkets. I saw people lining up, the queues that I've never seen in my life. People were going to the ATMs. People were trying to find what they can maybe store for themselves to eat, but the line was too long. The borders, the people who had their cars in the trading center, everyone wanted to go and park his car at home. So there was kind of a jam as well. The supermarkets were full. They were only allowing 8 people to enter and shop. Others were queuing outside. It was just crazy you could see around the supermarkets. I personally did not manage to find what I could use for myself. I just gave up. So I think the directives were okay, but then if more like they gave it a day for that people can organize that, those maybe who were planning to travel to their villages, some other people are also trying to find what they can maybe buy and store in their homes so that they can be surviving on. So I cannot tell right now, but I am just next to one of the local routes that connect to the trading center, and I hardly see anyone walking. I cannot even see any motorcycle, so that means people are not into
with Ivan Walunyolo, but he's telling us that he is seeing no taxi people, no borders, and he also contends that they could have given the people more time to do some shopping. He says there's panic buying and the lines are too long. But he mentioned one thing: the supermarkets that are still open are adhering to the standard operating procedures, and that are making sure that only 10 people enter a supermarket at a go, do the shopping, come out, and then the other group can go in. You also know that this can only spell one thing: lengthy lines in that regard. We are talking about 163,000 cases in the United States. You have 87,000 in Italy. You know, if 101,000, yes, cases in Italy, and you have Spain catching up with 97,000 cases. Well, we are still watching Morning at NTV, and we are still tracking the coronavirus. I think we've established the connection with Mr. Kataha Raymond. Yes, Ivan, let's go to Ivan and see what's happening where you are. A very good morning, Ivan. What's the latest?
Ramya, if you can see, the road down here is one of the local roads that can connect to Abaita Trading Center, but you can see it's only one person who is walking, and on a normal day this road takes, you can see in 1 minute about 50 people who are going to do different things at Abaita Trading Center, but you cannot see 1 or 2 people who are going to the local shops to buy something for themselves. But I'm telling you, people who are supposed to shop things that they would be using in their homes in this period of time bounced yesterday. Just like I said earlier on, there was a long queue in the supermarkets, long queues around the ATMs. So I think people have missed out and are now in their homes. I wonder what
Walunyolo reporting from Entebbe. As you've seen in that video, people have adhered to the presidential directive and are not moving. They're staying at home to ensure that they break the chain and transmission of COVID-19. I still have Mr. Emmanuel Mutaisibu, and we're still taking a look at what's happening in Uganda. But elsewhere in the world, like I told you, we are talking about 748,000 global cases of the coronavirus. 37,000 people have died, but fortunately, 164,000 people have recovered recovered from the coronavirus. You have the United States taking the lead with 164,000 cases. You also have Italy joining them with 101,000. You have Spain joining them with 97,000. You have China joining them. It stagnated at 81,000. I don't know what is happening in China, but it stagnated at 81,000. Let's now revert back to Kataha Raymond. We have established that connection. A very good morning once again, my brother. I understand you're in the House, so I'm not going to ask you whether or not the people in your area have adhered to the presidential directive, but in your own words, what do you make of the presidential directive?
Romeo, I woke up at 5 a.m. this morning to start my morning run, and immediately I hit the highway. I was met by at least 3 officers, 2 of them from the UPDF, 1 from Uganda Police Force, and I was asked to come back to my house and not continue with my jog. Of course, that is just at the roadside as we leave my home. It's broadly acceptable, even in Nigeria, that the lockdown has started to bite because there are no cars on the road. And I went back again at about 6:30 to see how the presidential directive was being adhered. But there are no cars on the road. Even the supermarkets which have essential goods normally are now closed. I'm talking about JSP and PK supermarket, where many people who stay this side have been shopping from. So broadly, you can say that the presidential lockdown directive is taking effect, but also maybe to give you another effect on its impact, I've had many of my neighbors who know that I'm a journalist. They've walked to me and asked me, how does this lockdown work? And of course, we don't have all the full details. We have only the speech that came from the president yesterday. And that's what I've been able to explain to them in terms of how the presidential lockdown has been working. Of course, Uganda is only but the 3rd in East Africa to effect what would look like a lockdown. Kenya has what you call a curfew, and Rwanda has what you call a full lockdown on the country, and South Sudan also has a curfew in their hometown. So Romeo, to give you a sense of things, it's that in Nigeria, when I tried my run in the morning, there were officers on the roadside telling people to go back to their homes, and they were saying it politely without canes. So maybe the presidential directive is already in force. I'll try once again to move around and show you in the community of Nigeria what's happening since the lockdown started.
To bear fruit, the targets that the government intends to achieve. Do you think this lockdown will bear fruit?
The government is really running ahead of time on the lockdown because all the countries that have effected a lockdown have effected it after they confirm a local-to-local transmission. But that could also be detrimental and dangerous because you enter into Italian proportions where a lockdown happened almost 4 days after the first local infection, and now we know the numbers of deaths that have come out of Italy. We also know the number of cases that they have in Italy. So government sort of preempted that local-to-local infection and had a broad lockdown. Remember, there's one of the patients in Masaka who the president has now clarified came back from the United Arab Emirates, was able to go to Masaka and stay with their family, and they've since infected 2 members of their family, a 53-year-old and a 24-year-old. So that's the basis upon which government relied on to effect this lockdown. Again, we should never lose track of the story. The track of the story is that unless people can stay in their homes for at least 14 days so that those with symptoms are brought to the health centers, it will be very broadly hard to catch the COVID-19 spread. In Kenya, the projections in terms of people who might get infected are now being projected to 5,000 people in the next 1 month. So in Uganda, we don't have our projections yet. But the COVID-19 team that's been working with the president has sort of told us that if this lockdown doesn't work, the community spread could be high and it would be hard to keep up with. Remember, of course, we don't have a very perfect national response team in terms of the healthcare centers and ICU beds we have to treat people. So the quickest route out is to effect a lockdown.
Mr. Kataha, I did talk to Ivan Walunyolo from Entebbe. He was telling us that the residents there were actually disgruntled, and they were saying that maybe the government should have given them more time to prepare for this lockdown. Do you contend that a government should have done the same, or do you think such an impromptu lockdown was the way to go?
There's only one way to look at lockdowns in terms of this COVID-19, and you look at lockdowns in the way that they've happened. In Wuhan, the epicenter of this COVID-19, the first lockdown came about 14 days after the first case was confirmed. And in Wuhan, you ended up having close to 20,000 cases in a small city. Now, if you look at what the Chinese government took in terms of measures to stop the spread of COVID-19, it effected a full lockdown on Wuhan for almost 2 months to be able to catch everywhere that the spread has been going. Now, if you compare that and juxtapose it with Italy, where there were cases confirmed, there was local community spread, and no lockdown happened for at least 3 days. Now they are the epicenter of COVID-19 in the sense that the number of people that have died since the COVID-19 outbreak hit Italy are just high in their numbers. But also we know that the president was broadly taking measures that had come from the COVID-19 response team. And that COVID-19 response team was getting these measures from the African Union Task Force, which sort of laid down what are some of the things to do in case a COVID-19 is confirmed. Now, Uganda has what you'd call imported cases. Those imported cases have come into contact with their families and infected them. Now, the problem is if those families then infect more people, then you have what you'd call the community spread.
Yes.
And community spread is really hard to catch. And that's why the lockdown was effected. If you also look at our neighbors in Rwanda, they pretty much did the same thing. From the moment they confirmed the first case, they went into a partial lockdown. And the moment they confirmed the community spread, they took on a full lockdown. So the Ugandan government has its hands tied here, that the only way to come out of this is to have a broad lockdown that doesn't allow people to move and have a community spread of COVID-19.
Mr. Kataha, it's a tricky situation in Rwanda. They did institute a lockdown, but then we are seeing the numbers skyrocket to 70. Kenya also did the same, but we are also seeing the numbers skyrocketing to 50, DRC to 81. But then the case right now, let's talk about the most basic scenario, what you encountered today morning while you were trying to leave your house. You were told to go back. Now, I'm wondering, if you were ill and you were trying to make your way to maybe a supermarket or a pharmacy to get some kind of reprieve, what would a normal or ordinary person do in that regard? People are not being allowed to move. So what about those people who need some essentials? What can they be doing during this interim?
Romeo, if you have the president's speech yesterday, it was that essential services in terms of doctors, in terms of health workers, will be allowed to go to their places and open up shop. Because for them, they're dealing with essential services of the country. Maybe that's where now we need to check the story.
Kataha, what I was saying...
Are they able to move around? I know for a fact that many hospitals which have transport systems have labeled their costers doctors, and they're able to move from their homes to the hospital. Now, maybe we need to ask, can the patients move to the hospitals? And those are measures that we can see as the lockdown starts to take effect. We are only in the 9th hour of this lockdown, and it will be interesting for us to look at how that response is perceived across the country and how that response is perceived by people who are giving out essential services. So we will, of course, be monitoring this story as the day goes by.
Indeed. Qatar Raymond, thank you very much for talking to us. It's been an absolute pleasure. I still have Emmanuel Mtaiziwa. He did misunderstand my question. I was asking him if he left the house to go just do a little bit of jogging and he was told go back, yet there are some supermarkets that are open. What is the essence?
Yes, and even before I answer that, the correspondent in Entebbe was very specific, Walunyolo. He says the challenge that people faced last night is the fact that it was about the immediacy of the lockdown. That the president said, if I postpone this, people as usual will drag their feet and will not be able to,
You talked about people fleeing to the villages.
So exactly what happened last night, and there's quite a lot of anecdote, is immediately it was 10 p.m. There are people who are typically out there looking for, to eke a living. The security personnel swung in action and started beating people. Now, this is wrong because we just saw it a day, yesterday, I think, is when we saw this, the chief of defense forces invite the vendors who had been beaten. So this takes away that act.
But Mutaiziwa, there's another issue right now.
So you talk about the issue of going to hospital that you asked Raymond. How do people get to hospital?
Yes.
Now, Today is a very good opportunity. We know there's the interministerial committee that's
True.
going to sit. These are some of the questions that the public expects.
Amazing, and they are watching.
How practical is this going to work? How is that person who needs insulin going to be able to go to hospital and yet they don't have, first of all, the public means, which is cheaper. Secondly, if they can, be able to get money, private means. 3, is the option that government may provide a car or an ambulance. How possible is it that it will reach the backwater in Kotido or wherever it is where there's a pregnant woman? And we must recall that 16 women die every day in Uganda while attempting to deliver. So once there's a strain in terms of transport, there's this very, there was this picture on social media, which basically tells the difficulty under which we can enforce the lockdown of this woman who was carrying the mother from Umbale Hospital on her back and walking back home. So we must look at some of these things from a practical point of view, whereas we all agree that the lockdown is the practical thing to do, and it's being enforced elsewhere to be able to curb the numbers. We must look at the practical terms. And then 2, we also must be a bit cautious with the issue to do with projections and numbers, because we cannot have the proper estimate from the context that we don't have random testing kits in place, just like South Korea can massively test 1,000 people and all these kind of things. We only have the Uganda virus.
By the way, their numbers have stagnated at 9,000.
Research
I don't know why.
That is
Even
able
Japan.
to test. So this may not give, just like Burundi actually, the better example to give is Burundi and South Sudan. They don't have this equipment to test. So whereas they have 0 cases, it's not the entire picture. But what I know is the teams at the Ministry of Health are doing a commendable job.
But don't you think for the case of South Sudan, it could be because of the conflict that just wound down recently? That's why they're not having any cases. You have Central African Republic registering only 3. Can you imagine? Somalia, 3 only, yet neighboring Ethiopia has 19 or 20.
I don't think it's the issue to do with conflict, because the two are not, don't bear parallels. I think the issue is more to do with the ability of the country to screen people who may show symptoms and be able to test them. So Uganda, we have this wonderful facility in Entebbe. That's how we've been able to establish, at least for now, the numbers of those who have been infected by the coronavirus.
You're still watching Morning at NTV. The numbers are pretty clear. Rwanda has 70 cases, DRC 81, Uganda 33, Kenya 50 cases. You have South Africa with 1,300 plus cases confirmed, and you also have Sudan, Northern Sudan with 6 cases, Egypt with over 639 cases. You're still watching Morning at NTV. Let's take a very short break. We'll be right back with more. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. Globally, we are talking about 784,000 infections of COVID-19. In Uganda, last week, the Uganda police set up the interagency task force to enforce the president's directive to ensure that people stay in their houses. We are going to be joined by the police spokesperson, Fred Nanga, to expound on the interagency task force and how far they've gone in actually enforcing the presidential directives. Yes, a very good morning, Mr. Nanga, if you can hear me. Yes, like I said, regionally we are talking about 70 COVID-19 cases in Rwanda. We're also talking about 50 COVID-19 cases in Kenya. We're also talking about 6 cases in Northern Sudan. Southern Sudan doesn't have a case, but my good friend Emmanuel Mtaiziwa tells me it's because they do not have the testing capability to sift out those people that might have been infected with the coronavirus. Well, I didn't mention to him it could have had something to do with political instability, but that's how it is. We have a divergent views. They are actually accepted right here in Morning at NTV. That's why I want to Involve you, the viewer who's watching. What do you make of the issues that we are talking about right here on the show? What do you make of the presidential directive? How are you going to survive during the 14 days? How are you going to make ends meet? Would like to know from your own, experience. How are you grappling, or how are you actually how are you grappling or adapting to the COVID-19? However way you'd want to look at it, we are actually tracking the coronavirus. Nigeria yesterday was talking about 111 cases. It skyrocketed today to 139. Yes, they are doing that badly. And I'm telling you, if we had not called for this lockdown, the situation would be far, far worse. Egypt, on the other side of the north, has 639 plus positive cases of the coronavirus. So you know what I'm talking about. South Africa has 1,300 plus confirmations of the coronavirus. And I still have my good brother Emmanuel Mutaiziba in studio with me, and we are still discussing the issue of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's talk about the timing and how people are going to be able to actually adapt to this situation as we move forward. How best, in your opinion, would the people adapt to the new measures?
Interesting question. I would look at it this way. What are the household incomes of Ugandans? I may not have the exact figure, but many people, a very large proportion, lives by hand to mouth. And this virus has, got us thinking to re-examine a couple of things. For instance, in the West, where we're seeing, so many numbers of fatalities and infections, there's some bit of, re-examination about the ruthless hand of capitalism. What perhaps socialism can provide. Why welfare states in Europe, like Germany perhaps, and Norway, may be able to offer a robust or be able to combat coronavirus at the level of households, that they still be able to provide, certain basic services, especially medical services.
The good news is that the president expounded on that. These people will be sifted out from the public, and they will be helped in that regard. But the problem right now is, how best is the government going to identify that this is a poor person and this who needs help, and this is a rich person who might be able to weather the storm? That is the question, because right now in Uganda, the middle class is non-existent. Am I right?
Like I said before, many households, as we speak, we've only had a partial lockdown for a week. I can tell you that many have exhausted their savings. So the question is, how are they surviving? What do we have in terms of food security? How is government going to come in to intervene? Who are the people it's going to identify that are the most vulnerable, that require food aid? The other question is, what kind of response is government going to offer at the time the economy is meek? Because as you are aware, tourism, which brings in lots of revenue, is on its knees. Remittances from abroad, people can no longer remit because they're out of work, they're at home, and all these kind of things. 3, the other very important sector is agriculture.
33 million farmers.
Agricultural exports have declined. Last month, Italy bought most of our coffee. Italy bought most of our coffee, which was our second largest export after gold.
The good thing you're talking about the
exports. That means that we can no longer send the same amounts of coffee. The biggest export we've been having is gold. Most of that gold is smuggled from Congo and South Sudan. So it won't come in. It won't be business as usual because we have all these enforcements at the border. Yes, please.
Well, before we link to Julius Mukunda, the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Executive Director, we are still expounding more on the COVID-19 pandemic. But another issue, before anything else, is how are our authorities enforcing the presidential directive? Are they observing the standard operating procedures? We heard from the Professional Standards Unit, that is the Commission of Police. Yesterday, he did mention that, yes, if you're a police officer, an army officer, and you're engaged in human rights abuses, you will be held liable. Your file will be sent to the DPP, and that could lead to a dismissal or discharge. Now, those are two different words. Dismissal, they won't give you a coin. A discharge, yes, you'll get some kind of package. But then I was so happy, and many other human rights activists were so happy when the Uganda police actually came out to say that they will rein in on any police officers who actually abuse people's rights as they try to enforce the presidential directive. That's why we are trying to establish a connection with the police spokesperson, Freddie Nanga, to tell us how the interagency task force that was initiated last week with hand in hand with the Ministry of Health, how are they trying, how are they working together to ensure that the presidential directives are enforced in a peaceful manner and no one is actually abused in the process. I still have Emmanuel Mutaiziwa. Let's talk about a little bit about adhering to the presidential directives and the officers who are misinterpreting the presidential directive, like you verifiably had from Kataha Raymond. He was leaving his house, trying to go and jog. Remember, the curfew has to start at 7 p.m. today. So he was still at liberty to go ahead with his business, as long as he doesn't have a private car, as long as he's just, walking. So do you think our officers still need more training to actually get acquainted with how to enforce the presidential directives?
The question about civil liberties is they must exist even when we have a crisis.
Indeed.
You can't, enforce things like torture, beat up people, and use force that is, reasonably beyond, what is expected to be able to persuade this person perhaps to leave the streets. And we must also put this in context that the most vulnerable people, when there are these kind of outbreaks or these kind of pandemics, are the poor people. So on top of them, being the most vulnerable, the people who live in the slums and can't enforce social distancing, meaning that if there's an outbreak in Katanga, it will spread because people share a shack. Two, they are the people with the least incomes. It means when they go back home, they are food insecure. So depression will set in, domestic violence will set in during these times because they live in very squalid kind of conditions. So those are vulnerable people. So when they come out to the streets to try and eke a living and try, to dodge the lockdown, you don't have to use a sledgehammer to enforce this lockdown. You can use persuasive means. And I was very impressed by the CD of General David Muhoozi, who came out yesterday and was remorseful for the actions of the high-handed officers who beat up these women.
I think he did meet the ladies.
Yes, which was
good.
Quite a good thing.
Good gesture.
Say, yes.
Yeah. So how, I don't know, these officers who are violating some. Go ahead. You're talking. Go ahead.
Yes. So basically, it would be a good thing that some of these officers are apprehended. And if it means that there's some kind of disciplinary action taken against them.
It will indeed be taken. Let's get first-hand information from the police spokesperson himself, Freddie Nanga, who joins us now via phone. Very good morning, Mr. Enanga. How is the interagency task force enforcing the presidential directive? A very good morning. Mr. Enanga, you're on air. Mr. Enanga, if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Good morning.
Yes, a very good morning, sir. Yes, last week you launched the interagency task force to try to enforce the presidential directives. Right now, we want you to help us, give us an update on the same.
Yeah, thank you very much, and to all our listeners out there, good morning. Yeah, also, what we can say is that this is the third occasion that we are coming out with the mechanisms following the additional guidelines to the President in close coordination with the Minister of Health. Now, beginning last night, you you are aware that there was a ban on the use of private vehicles, including the borders and other categories of vehicles, as described by His Excellency the President, and on persons and different categories of workers.
Yes.
So the enforcement began last night, beginning 10 onwards, but of course we gave a bit of an extension, the fact that there could have been some people or people driving home and a little distance while in transit. For instance, if you had some the car come.
Yes, go ahead.
So we had discretion that was appropriate. And as I talk this morning, we have our joint security team, motorized, those that are on foot patrols. They are actually out there. But I would like to comment public. The response has been good, and we are not seeing seeing so many people out there. Those who are, we've met a few people who have IDs and fall in the essential category of persons going to work, including members of the media whom we've been able to clear under exceptional circumstances.
Mr.
We
Nanga,
are trying to, yes, please.
My colleague Kataha Raymond was trying to leave his house, but he was stopped by some officers who told him to go back home. And we do understand that the enforcement of the curfew doesn't start until 7 p.m. Was that procedurally right?
How was he getting home? Because
he was jogging from his house. He tried to leave his house to go out to jog.
No, in which does he fall? Because what we are trying to avoid here is trying to get into situations where this enforcement mechanism is diluted. Now, you are aware that even you who fall in the category of the media, you're supposed to make work easy by coordinating with the Ministry of Health and Transport to ensure that there are stickers on your vehicles, so that we can get to know that our colleagues from the media, maybe from Nation Group, these are the people who, because most of the companies are on site, we can easily tell that this one is an story and has a sticker, so you don't get inconvenienced as you get along the way. So we could try to explore that so that we have a very organized arrangement of movement, and people won't get restricted anyhow. But enforcement continues.
Mr. Nanga, take us through how Uganda Police is going to be enforcing the curfew after 7 p.m.
You are very much aware that the communication of His Excellency the President clearly indicates there's very high restricted movement. Actually, it clearly indicates that once we get a group of persons who in numbers of 5, and you know that we have a duty to get to disperse some such groups of people, because what we are trying to avoid is that social contact, minimizing contact, because that's the way that we can get to fight this coronavirus. And so that is something very easy to enforce, because we have foot patrols that are out there. We are going to continue monitoring the conduct of and the movement these other categories in markets, the essential shops like pharmacies, agricultural inputs, who will be going back home and how they are going back. It's always good that they plan their movement much earlier, ensure that they are not in conflict with the guidelines that have been issued. There, nobody is going to find problems with our frontline officers.
So ideally, it's okay for me to walk right to now up to 7 p.m., but after that, I'm not allowed.
Of course, you have to give explanation on as to why you are getting delayed, because it's all planning and working very, very closely with our territorial team. Just to ensure of the RDCs, the DPCs, all the other, you have those necessary contacts with you, such that if we can actually do something, we can coordinate that.
Okay, coordinate with the local leaders. My friend, my good man here, Emmanuel Mtaiziwa, has a question for you as we wrap up, Mr. Inanga.
Yes, please.
Mr. Nanga. Good morning.
Mtaiziwa, how are you?
Very well, sir. Yes, my question is very specific about last night when the president made the pronouncement about the lockdown. I have quite a lot of anecdotal evidence where some of your officers went ahead and used, extremely ruthless means to enforce this lockdown. Now, typically, there was a person who was at the marketplace who was not aware that at 10 p.m. the president would, enforce a lockdown would be enforced. There are people who are moving from, perhaps hospitals. Whereas we see that some people actually act in a very, indisciplined manner. Some cyclists are errant and all these kind of things. I think what's very critical is we must enforce civil liberties during this period, because people are going through a lot of strain and a lot of challenges. How are you ensuring that your officers must strictly adhere to, issues in regard to civil liberties?
Well, would be happy if you shared those concerns that you're talking about, because remember very well that this new enforcement came after we got to some videos in the previous enforcement that we did carry out, where we had a few of our officers who were a bit overzealous in persons who were flouting the directive. And you monitored yesterday, the CDF came out very strongly on some of the members of the Joint Task Force, like LDUs, including police officers, who were using excessive force. So it was something that was addressed at the level of the service chiefs when they came up with the additional guidelines for our officers to adopt very humane and holistic approaches with very appropriate measures. I would like to inform you that, for instance, yesterday, immediately after 10, the Deputy Inspector General of Police came up with the additional guidelines on the online platform that we, communication platform, and reminded our commanders on flexibility, on correct statements, and not harassing people who are caught up. It is easy for us to tell somebody who is actually caught delayed getting back home and somebody who is defiant. So we haven't gotten any new complaint. But I believe this time you're going to see very, very much change in the way that we conduct our enforcement. There has been very good briefing. But if I told you, like you're saying, who could have been victimized through excessive use of force, please, our lines are open under the Joint Task Force. Please share this with us so that we can get to establish establish the circumstances.
Indeed,
But so far, so good.
indeed. Thank you very much, Mr. Enanga, right there. Fred Enanga is the spokesperson of the Uganda Police, and was very kind to find time during these very, very, very trying times to speak to us on what the Interagency Task Force is doing to enforce the presidential directive. Right now, we are now joined by the Executive Director of the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group, Julius Mukunda, to talk about the economic impact of the coronavirus. A very good morning, Mr. Julius, and thank you for joining us on Morning at NTV.
Morning, Romy. Morning, how are you?
So the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group is calling upon government to reallocate the Q4 funds for the financial year 2019-2020 for the fight against COVID-19. How feasible is this?
How visible, Romy? I mean, we have never had a better reason to allocate funds than now. This is a national disaster. It's a pandemic. And I think we need to focus most all our investments in ensuring that we save lives. And I think it's very important that we save lives. We also know that our health budget has consistently been, and our health sector has consistently been underfunded. So it's really very important that we focus our attention on ensuring that we have enough resources in the Ministry of Health. And let's not get worried that we don't have the resources. We have the money. It's just a question of now, I think, reallocation, really. That's a very important part. We need really to overhaul our budget priorities and refocus our attention majorly on health, but also as you know what we have been talking about, and also on how to revamp our economy, because a sick economy can bring even more devastating negative effects than the COVID-19.
Thank you so much, Mr. Julius. My question is, as you're aware, as CS BAG, you conduct quite a number of surveys. Close to over 40% of Ugandans earn less than $1 a day.
Yes.
How is that in terms of the practical sense that for the last 1 week or so, when we've had this partial lockdown, and now we're going to have another lockdown of perhaps a fortnight, in terms of the practicability for the category of people who earn less than $1 a day, what should we expect that they cannot now eke a living, they can no longer earn this $1 a day in terms of their food security, in terms of the household income, in terms of providing for their families, in terms of providing medication and food? How can government intervene?
If I heard you correctly, you're talking about people who are earning less than $1 a day. The majority of Ugandans, and now they're on lockdown. How are we going to survive? And I think for me, that's our the biggest problem that we are likely to face. Is that really most of them wake up to go and look for what to eat. That's it. And right now you are telling them, please, we don't want you to get out and work. Let's talk ordinarily about a border person, really. I mean, you wake up in the morning to go and look for money for that particular day. If you have it, maybe you're looking for money for tomorrow, because last night you came with money. How they will survive? And this is what we have been talking about, that our social security system social protection system must be revamped. Because really, if you lock down on people for 14 days, I'm just telling you that those probably who can't manage at all are going to have more problems. But I think this is a bitter period we need to take now, because I can assure you, if you look at other countries, what has taken place under this pandemic, yet they have advanced health systems. If we don't take this kind of bitter period now, I can tell you is that we are going to die like flies. That is for sure. So the biggest inconvenience we are having is right now, government must come in place to provide meals, food rations, especially in urban areas. Fortunately, in rural areas, the biggest majority can be able to afford to get a meal because they are still being allowed to, to go to their gardens. The biggest challenge we are having in national urban centers, and I think government, the president says is going to provide food. This must be done very quickly. Even by beginning today, that's my sense that we need to provide meals for those who can't afford it. But most importantly also is that we need to be very transparent. The OPM case is still very fresh in our mind. It is in situations like this that people take advantage and begin to eat money that is meant to help us get out of this pandemic. The National Task Force on COVID-19 must be transparent on a daily basis. They must release a list of how much they have received in terms of money and in terms of other items and how they are distributing them. That will bring confidence among us that our money is not being misused. But I can tell you that the consequences in terms of health for those who are likely to miss a meal even is going to be high. And as such, government must come in very quickly to provide meals for those who can't afford them.
And of course, government is working on that, Mr. Mukunda, but thank you for actually reiterating that. And another question, your organization, CSBAG, says the central bank, which is Bank of Uganda, should in the meantime remove restrictions associated with buffer or capital requirements for financial institutions. This will in turn allow banks to lend to trustworthy households or businesses. The question is, how are we planning for something that we do not know?
I think we are very optimistic that we shall overcome this. That's the number one. But as we put up the National Task Force on COVID-19, we also must have a task force on economic recovery. And I can tell you is that right now, people must sit behind and begin to plan how to do the economic recovery because businesses are on a standstill. Economies around business activities, buying and selling, production and consumption. If these things are not working well, we are on a standstill on a ground, on a hold. And as such, we are saying businesses definitely that are not working cannot pay back their loans. That's number one. Number two is that if you get out of this, you don't have cash on you. And therefore, the central bank must be able to, they have almost like 4.5 trillion in terms of buffer from these financial institutions, that you allow this buffer, some of it, not all of it, some of it back to financial institutions so that they have enough liquidity to lend out to the credit-worthy businesses. And I love that you mentioned credit-worthy businesses and households. Because again, we know in this kind of situation, you have unscrupulous traders and businesses that will get loans and run away. So again, that's what we are talking about, that we must have enough liquidity in the economy that banks can be able to provide to small businesses to be able to start running, to be able to buy inputs, to be able to pay wages, to be able to do research if they want to do research, to be able to transport their products, to be able to, so many things that can happen that they can use this particular money. Without that, I can tell you, is that it is going to take longer. The pain is going to be much in terms of recovering this economy. Okay. The opportunity is that we can also still start producing some of these things. I'm glad that sanitizers now can be produced locally, but we can even do more than that. The amount of money coming from World Bank and the IMF to support UDB, we specifically would request that this money should go to small scale and medium enterprises. Companies like MTN have never had trouble getting credit. They can never have trouble getting credit. But these other small and medium enterprises always have trouble getting credit. So we want that. If we focus on that, the 2.5 million people that are being employed by small and medium enterprises get back to work.
That is a very, very, very valid argument. Mutaisibwa?
Julius,
yes.
My question is,
yes.
At this very critical time, We know the situation of the economy. We have low, we've been having, we've not been hitting our targets in terms of tax collection. And recently,
Yes.
the president appointed a new person to take over this coveted role. Bank of Uganda made a loss. Tourism is on its knees. Our exports have been affected. Where are we going to get this stimuli? And what areas of the economy are going to be the priority? And then two, what kind of austerity measures? Because we see this, you know, it was very interesting in Kenya when we saw the president, you know, come out and announce that he's going to take a pay cut. So is the VP 80%, I think, and then the PSCs and the ministers. What areas are we looking at when we have a kind of war situation? Which areas are we going to enforce these austerity measures? And my last one is this not the time now to look at our reserves? That's why countries have reserves. That when you're in such a very critical time, then you tap on your reserves and you're able to stabilize the economy.
Yes, I think thanks. These are the valid questions, and I'm very sure that our new person at URA, I mean, he has been thrown in he has been given a very tough job at a time when everything is just going, you know, just going down in terms of revenues. That's number one. So I'm not seeing any economic indicator right now that is favorable for us. I don't see it at all. I don't see it. And the new person at the URA, even the new deputy governor, I'm very sure right now he's not having he's having sleepless nights, because to be in this kind of situation when everything is practically going wrong, and you have been having, you know, and things have not been working well, is a nightmare. So austerity is number one. That's very important. And austerity in terms of what? We must cut luxurious expenses. Luxurious expenses are there in the budget. And I've mentioned, for example, at this time, we don't need to buy a hose. No, a 1 million hose. We can reserve that for another time. At this time, traveling abroad and abroad should be cut out completely. At this time, creation of new administrative units should be cut out completely. Even these other new ones they have just created, they can actually suspend them, and we can start in the next 10 years when we have recovered and have enough resources.
Julius Mukunda, the Executive Director of the Civil Society Budget Advocacy Group, thank you very much for having made the time to speak to us.
Thanks so much, Romy. It was a pleasure all the time.
Amazing. So I still have Emmanuel Mutaiziwa in studio, and we are still tracking the coronavirus. We now want to get an update from Masaka. We have the RDC, the Resident District Commissioner of Masaka, Mr. Robert, and he's ready to give us an update on whether or not people there are adhering to the presidential directive. Let's get the latest from Masaka.
The people of Masaka have responded to the presidential directive by keeping away from using the means of transport that they were stopped from using. There's been some challenges from those going to work in banks and private health facilities. This is something that we shall see eventually after we've sat today on what to do. But by and large, there is compliance, and the people understand why the president made these stringent measures in order for them and for everybody to stay safe. The presidential speech was awaited by many people. It was watched by many people, and they have responded positively to the presidential directive. The presidential directive was clear, and it will be enforced. Its enforcement is in good faith. It was made in good faith. We, as a country, must ensure that COVID-19 does not multiply and attack other people than the ones that we have now, because if that happens, we shall have a problem. So we shall enforce that directive without fear or favor. The president was clear in case of sick people, very sick people, like pregnant mothers who are due for delivery. I will be responsible in liaison with the health personnel in authorizing these people to go to hospital, because when we want to save lives, we can't lose lives. When, like the case of a pregnant mother who is due and is required hospital happens, we have to respond such that the mother and the baby are delivered safely at hospital. I will authorize movement in such cases. I have a meeting today at 9 o'clock with security agencies and health personnel. I head the task force for COVID-19, and in that task force meeting, we shall see what we have to do as far as health is concerned. Then in the security meeting, we shall devise means and ways of ensuring that the directive is implemented as the president indicated. This is national, and it was made in response to an enemy, so to speak, that has ravaged the whole world. All of us have seen, we have heard what's happening in developed countries. We did not stop vehicles or even motorcycles carrying cargo. You can always call a border and they bring you stuff that you need at home. That wasn't stopped. A vehicle bringing you supplies was not stopped. What was stopped is people crowding in vehicles and using, so to speak, those vehicles to transfer the disease from one point to the other, especially since we don't know for sure who is sick and who is not.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Sentongo.
Mr. Haman Sentongo, the Resident District Commissioner of Masaka District, acquainting us with the latest with regards to whether or not the residents in that area are adhering to the presidential directives. Now, we're getting information right here on right here on our desk that no one shall be stopped if they are transporting a pregnant mother to hospital. That's the message of the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health, Dr. Diana Atwine. She has stressed it clearly, and she says more clarification will be relayed later on in that regard. But mothers shouldn't be stopped if they are being ferried to the hospital for such emergency services. Let's now head over to Gulu, talk to our reporter Nelson Omoya to tell us how people in Gulu are actually adhering to the presidential directive or not. Mr. Nelson Omoya, a very good morning. What's the latest in Gulu?
Yes, good morning, Romeo. Gulu is quite calm this morning, just like it has always been the case. Gulu shops don't open like so early, but tried moving around to check on how people are picking up with the latest directives from the president. And there are a few shops that still remain open this morning, especially grocery shops. But I'm also seeing a few dealing in clothes, shoes, also still open. But the way they've opened the doors is like halfway, meaning they're still not sure whether they will operate throughout the day. And I'm also seeing a few places, stationery shops, which are also open. But for others like electronics, they're all closed. The phone shops are all closed this morning. The saloons all still remain closed as well. There's still not much any deployment on the street like many were expecting yesterday. They thought there was going to be a heavy deployment probably early in the morning, but I think that is going to be effected later.
Yes.
Although the task force here in Gulu has not had much of a big challenge ever since the president began giving in directives, because the level of compliance in Gulu has been so high. So to me, I feel the task force has not had much of a big challenge. But Romeo, something that happened today.
Yes.
I woke up at about 4 a.m. Not because that is my routine time for waking up.
Yes.
But there was a strange thing that happened here, not only in Bulo, but I'm told in all the 8 districts of Acholi.
Yes.
Where people woke up at around 4, banging jerry cans, banging all sorts of containers, anything that would produce sound. Others were banging on the doors because information that came around is that one of the local gods talked to people and said this required a spiritual warfare. So
spiritual
many
warfare.
woke up banging jerry cans.
Go ahead.
Yes, please. So many were banging jerry cans and making all sorts of noise, trying to chase because they say this is a demon. It required a spiritual warfare. So that is what woke many people very early in the morning. And we are yet to get an update from the task force on what they have to say, especially on the approach that the locals took, and then secondly, in response to the new directives that the president placed yesterday.
Yes.
But otherwise, the situation still looks calm, and I think it might not be so different from how people have complied to the other directives that the president has given before. Although these ones seem to be much more than the other one and seem to be more harder, so we're still not sure how compliant they will be this time round. But that is how the situation here is in Bulo.
Mr. Omoya, you
Yes,
mentioned
please.
something about spiritual warfare. Please, can you expand that in only 20 seconds? Something
Now,
about
what happens
spiritual,
is-
something. I didn't get that.
Now, in most cases, this used to happen like towards the end of the year, where there are gods within that people still tend to believe in, and they say the gods of the ancestors. So, according to information that came in yesterday, that one of the gods talked to people and said this does not require any other approach but using a spiritual warfare. where they should
Thank you.
use the
I now
traditional
get
way
it.
of
I
banging
now
the-
get it, Omoya. It's okay. It was a bit confusing, but I now get it. Thank you very much for that update from Gulu.
Welcome.
Okay, Nelson Omoya was reporting from Gulu. I still have Emmanuel Mtaiziwa, but